Welcome back to another episode of What a Fustercluck. I'm your host, Lolita Keys. And as always, there's always something fun to talk about. And this week, before we dive into the episode, your friendly daily reminder to please like, share, and subscribe to What a Fustercluck on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Your support means the world to me. And I always appreciate when somebody shares the content, subscribes. The subscription is really the most important thing. And I know that's the hardest thing for podcast audiences to kind of stop and do. But if you could take a moment and remember before I jump into the content to like, share, and subscribe. Most importantly, subscribe to What a Fustercluck so that you never miss a drop and you get to hear more fun, exciting content from the mind of a middle-aged mom just trying to figure it all out in the Fustercluck of it all. This week was a huge win in common sense thinking. Before we get into the Supreme Court decision that was made this week, among many, there were several that were made, but the one that I feel the most passionate about is the one about men competing in women's sports, biological men competing in women's sports. But I do want to ask you something. I want to ask you, when did it become controversial to say that a biological male has a physical advantage over a biological female in athletic competition? When did that become controversial? I think if we all sit back and really think about it, it's kind of easy to identify when in the zeitgeist that actually happened. Because somewhere along the way, stating that fact out loud got people fired, deplatformed, and called hateful, which is far from the truth. And this week, 6 Supreme Court justices essentially said no more, and I want to talk about it. I've broken this episode down into multiple different segments, so please stay with me. And as always, I do try to end every episode with a unifying message that sort of brings all of the chaos together and helps us level set where we are, who we are, how we're thinking, how we're all getting by in this crazy, polarized world where social media and our algorithms just seem to rule and to feed our and confirm our biases more than ever before. It used to be that you could turn on the news and hopefully get some kind of balanced perspective, hopefully get real journalism, not a journalist's opinion, but real reporting. Now, maybe they stripped out certain things to try to help you think along a certain ideology. I know that this has been going on forever. This is nothing new. But never before has there been such control over our minds based on the very algorithm in your phone, meant to feed the things that keep you hooked in the attention economy. So please remember that. Please remember confirmation bias is a real thing. Let's get into the first segment, which is the ruling. So what actually happened? And I'm going to be checking my notes several times during this podcast because I do want to make sure that I get the statistics right. I love my numbers and I want to keep it as real as I possibly can and go through some of the research that I've done. On June 30th, 2026, the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 ruling upholding state laws that ban transgender athletes, specifically biological males, from competing in women's and girls' sports. The decision, written by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, reversed lower court rulings that had blocked such bans as violation of Title IX and the 14th Amendment. The key facts that I want you to think about are, number one, the ruling broke along ideological lines. 6 conservative justices in favor with 3 liberal dissenters. I know right there, just with that first statistic, it's just like, why does it have to be this way? Why does it have to be this way? Why, should you be a more conservative person to hold this thing to be true? That is sort of the first thing that just, I wish we could get beyond. But alas, we can't. And this is one of the things that makes me nervous about the Supreme Court overall and why a balanced panel is so important. And I say that as someone who's in favor of this ruling with the clear understanding that it was 6 conservative justices who held this. Now, the decision specifically addressed cases out of Idaho, 1, a college track athlete, and 2, a West Virginia middle school student. Kavanaugh's majority opinion stated, sports are highly competitive and generally zero-sum. At almost every turn, someone wins and someone loses. In many cases, it was the biological females and girls and women that were the ones at the losing end. Continuing on, and that state's interest in safety and competitive fairness justified the sex-based classification in this ruling. The ruling does not affect states that chose to allow trans athletes. There are 21 states that still permit trans athletes to participate in cross-sex sports. I'm sure you can guess what those states are, but among them is the obvious California, New York, and again, several others. However, 27 states had already enacted bans before this ruling came to be. The decision was narrow. It did not declare that Title IX never protects transgender students broadly, just that in competitive sports, biological sex can be the deciding factor. One thing I want you to consider after this ruling is that in a 2025 Gallup poll, 69% of Americans, I believe over 20,000 Americans surveyed, believe that transgender girls should compete only on boys' teams. This is not a fringe view. This isn't a ruling that came from hate. It came from logic. And the fact that it took this long, this much chaos, this much craziness, and this much legal battle to get here tells you something about how far we have drifted from common sense. Because in my mind, that is what this boils down to. And that is not me diminishing the rights of any transgender person in this country. I am very pro live your lifestyle as long as the lifestyle that you are living is not harming your fellow neighbors and compatriots and countrymen, then I am in favor of you living whatever life you choose, whether you're transgender or not. The next segment that I want to dive into is how we got here and why the Trump election makes more sense now than ever. And I find it very ironic that so many people hate Trump. So many people just absolutely despise Trump. And I would caution you to remember that it's that kind of hate. It's that kind of hate that fuels sometimes the very thing that you don't want. And so for everyone out there who despises Trump and didn't vote for Trump simply because they hated him, not even because they necessarily thought Kamala was the best choice, but just they hated Trump so much, I would ask you to take a step back and think about how fringe, niche movements can become such a talking point for a candidate that it loses you, your winning candidate. A significant factor in Trump's 2024 victory, even among voters who actually did dislike him, was the feeling that mainstream cultural institutions had abandoned basic common sense in favor of ideological fringe positions. The transgender athlete debate was one of the most visible flashpoints in this last presidential election cycle. Trump campaigned heavily on this issue in 2024 and even went as far as signing an executive order in February 2025 directing that schools allowing trans women in girls' sports were in violation of Title IX and at risk of losing federal funding. A very radical move indeed, but one that kept the flames fanned. In the days after that executive order, the NCAA and the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee both barred transgender women from women's competition. The sense that mainstream media and institutions refused to acknowledge what most people understood intuitively, which is that biology affects athletic performance, this created a credibility crisis. And I'm going to go back to the common sense argument, and I'm going to go back to anyone out there's extreme disdain for President Trump. But at the end of the day, thank God for common sense. And thank God for the reality that this type of thinking created this credibility crisis and got people asking themselves the question, what the hell is going on? When the public feels, when the people feel that approved position requires them to deny what they know innately, what they plainly see with their human eyes, They stop trusting the institutions that are saying it. I don't care how many times you repeat a talking point. My eyes don't lie. My eyes do not lie. What I know innately to be true does not lie. This is not uniquely a conservative feeling. Again, many liberal feminists, often called gender critical feminists, because of course we have to put a label on everything, also raised alarms about this issue and were dismissed or silenced for their opinion. J.K. Rowling being one of the most prominent examples internationally of what happens when you go against the fringe. J.K. Rowling, the creator of Harry Potter, once admired a woman who came from nothing and went on to have everything, winning the hearts and minds of people's imagination, regardless of your ideology and your political leaning. Even she got the brunt of this argument after she spoke out against trans women, biological men, competing in women's sports and robbing women of titles that they worked so hard for. There are a few blind spots that I want to raise. The trans athlete issue affected statistically a small number of athletes, but it is symbolic and its weight is enormous. When voters feel like institutions will choose an ideology over fairness in any arena, they extrapolate. That's part of why this became such a powerful political issue beyond its actual numerical impact. Again, small, niche, fringe issues that have the ability to completely poison a society is really what we're talking about here. I want to jump into Title IX and what women actually worked so hard to build and why this ruling is so crucial to women's rights. Many of you may recall in some of the recent episodes I've done about radical feminism and my thoughts on what really has happened to women over multiple generations and decades at this point. The lies that we have been sold will probably laugh and say, why do you care so much about this if you're so anti-feminism? It's not that I'm anti-feminism. Again, I will repeat, I am anti-radical feminism. Anytime the pendulum swings too far in the other direction, we are going down a slippery slope. Title IX passed in 1972 as part of the Education Amendments Act. 37 words that banned sex-based discrimination in federally funded education programs. Before it passed, you guys, only 1% of college athletic budgets went to women's sports. Only 1% of college athletic budgets went to women's sports. Female athletes outnumbered male athletes 12.5 to 1 in high school. Athletic scholarships for women were virtually non-existent, even though the female number outweighed the male number. This is a major discrepancy and one worth balancing. In 1972, fewer than 300,000 women and girls played college and high school sports combined. By 2012, the number of girls in high school sports had increased tenfold to over 3 million. College women's participation rose sixfold. By 2016, 1 in 5 girls played sports. Before Title IX, it was 1 in 27. Let me repeat. By 2016, 1 in 5 girls played sports. Before Title IX, before 1972, that number was 1 in 27. Billie Jean King testified before Congress to help this law pass. The 1999 Women's World Cup, watched by 90,000 plus fans at the Rose Bowl, was a direct product of Title IX. Female participation in collegiate athletics rose 456% between 1972 and 2008. That's a hell of a lot of hard work, you guys. That is a hell of a lot of positive change. But the irony worth naming here is that Title IX was designed to protect women from sex-based discrimination in education. Some argued it should be used to require the inclusion of biological males in women's sports. But the Supreme Court said that is not what this law was for. Now I'm going to say a word that unfortunately has also been demonized by the public, by the media, I should say, by the mainstream media. And that is to say let's talk about the science. This is the part where people get very triggered. When you say that biological sex is indisputable and it is in fact a science, you immediately bring out the culture warriors. So I don't want you to think that the words I'm about to say are going to go down that narrow path. But I do want to highlight why the science was never actually controversial at all. The physiological performance gap between biological males and females is not opinion. It is among the most well-documented findings in sports science. This was not controversial up until the last decade, I would say. Male puberty generates testosterone levels 10 to 15 times higher than females. And this testosterone drives permanent change. Things like increased muscle mass, bone density, lung capacity, heart size, and hemoglobin levels, which is what carries the oxygen to the muscles. If you just pause right there and think about the scientific statistical difference between biological males and biological women, and you sit in that for just a moment, lung capacity and hemoglobin levels, which carry oxygen to muscles, and you have increased muscle mass as a male because of the fact that you have 10 to 15 times more the testosterone than a female during puberty. And you cannot take that fact and realize that indeed you would have a competitive advantage, even as a biological male who's on hormone blockers or on hormone therapy for transitioning. It's indisputable, absolutely indisputable, and a wild, obvious advantage for the biological male. These advantages are built again during puberty, meaning that even after hormone therapy, the underlying structural advantages remain. A 2025 peer-reviewed study in drug testing and analysis found that male physical advantages in elite sports driven by the experience of male puberty are not erased by estrogen therapy. The physiological remodeling of puberty is not fully reversible. Let me say that again. The physiological remodeling of puberty is not fully reversible. After the examination of 82 events across 5 Olympic disciplines shows that there are very few sporting disciplines where males do not have a significant performance advantage as a result of testosterone-driven physiology. This is why the IOC originally used a testosterone threshold, which was 10 nanometers per liter, I believe is the measurement, to divide male and female athletic divisions, and why even that has been questioned as insufficient. So Kavanaugh's majority opinion cited this body of science directly, quote, "The competitive advantage boys and men have physically over girls and women has been well established in physically demanding sports by medical research." An important nuance that I want to model and an indicator of intellectual honesty is that this does not mean that trans women are cheating or actually acting in bad faith. That is not what I'm saying, and that is not my argument. It means that biology creates structural realities that affect competitive fairness, and that designing a fair category for female athletes requires acknowledging these realities. Fairness for women and compassion for trans individuals are not mutually exclusive. They are, however, sometimes in genuine tension, which you can feel the tension in these groups of folks who come hell or high water, regardless of what the science says, want to believe that this is fair, that biological males competing in women's sports is fair. And pretending otherwise, it's not kindness. It is truly an invasion. It is an invasion on reality. And again, common sense, which is the theme of this episode. Here is also something that most people do not realize in this argument about boys, girls, men, women who decide to transition to the opposite sex. It's the detransition component and the harsh truths about why waiting matters, why waiting to make the decision to transition matters. Does this mean that the life of a child who is a boy or who is a girl and truly believes that they are the opposite sex is going to be an easy journey or an easy road. No. But I 100% believe that in the year 2026, we are doing a hell of a lot better in this area by teaching our own kids equality, by teaching our own kids not to judge people based on the way they act. I mean, of course, unless they're truly psycho. But I certainly teach this message to my children. It doesn't matter if you're gay, straight, trans. It does not matter if you are not hurting me, if you are not hurting my children. It does not matter. Literally, we can all be friends. And at the end of the day, you're not going to be best friends with everyone. You're just not going to gravitate towards everyone. You're not going to like everyone. This is why our friend groups are typically a small group of people. Even very popular people really only have so many very close friends. And the fact is, we're just not all going to be best friends. We don't live in that kind of a world. This is not a fairy tale. So again, this is not me saying that it's easy to hold a child back from transitioning if that's truly what they want and that's really who they believe themselves to be before they are an adult. Now, the most statistically contested section of this episode is going to be right here. This is what the research actually shows. I want to present you with certain nuances so that nobody can knock me down for what I'm about to say. But here's what we know about detransition rates, because this is the truth that oftentimes people want to gloss over, is that there are men and women out there, boys and girls out there who transition and they do regret it. They do regret it. And this is the piece here that I'm going to dive into. And I don't care if it's only 0.001% of those people. When you are robbed of your fertility because you did not have proper informed consent, because you were not an adult when you decided to go through your transition, there are serious life-altering consequences that everyone needs to be aware of. A large U.S. transgender survey of 27,715 respondents found that 13.1% of those who had received gender-affirming treatment reported a history of detransitioning at some point. 13.1%. Now, I realize this number could be a lot higher, but again, as I said, I don't care if it's 0.001%. There's a percentage of people who do regret their decision and do want to detransition. And this is the point that we have to keep in mind. Of those 13% who detransitioned, the majority of them, 82.5%, cited external pressures, family rejection, job difficulty, societal stigma, rather than a change in gender identity. A smaller subset, roughly about 16%, cited internal factors, including uncertainty or fluctuation in gender identity. Surgical regret rates in systematic reviews typically cluster around 1 to 3%, though critics note that these studies often have high dropout rates, making the numbers hard to interpret with confidence. But nonetheless, these are the numbers. One 2021 National Transgender Healthcare Initiative survey found 9% reported complete regret and a desire to fully detransition. But what they often don't realize is that that is almost impossible. A key finding relevant to this argument is that individuals who delay transition until the age of 30 or older report approximately 50% lower regret rates compared to those who transitioned before 18. And this was per a 2019 meta-analysis in the Journal of Higher Education. So all I am saying here is that there is a point in time when making this decision comes with less regret and less of a desire to then go back and detransition. Here is what we know about puberty blockers and minors. There are side effects, and these side effects documented by the Mayo Clinic include decreased bone density, potential impacts on fertility, changes in growth patterns, and possible effects on cognitive development. Bone density typically surges during puberty, and puberty blockers can flatline that growth. And evidence suggests that many do not fully recover that lost bone density, We haven't even scratched the surface of what this means later in life. We know that women are more prone to osteoporosis because of what happens during pre and post menopause, with estrogen dropping, with progesterone dropping, and what that does to a woman's bone density and why it's so important to work out and lift weights. And so who knows what the future is going to hold for some of these folks who took these puberty blockers and what is actually going to happen later on in their lives and who's having those conversations and doing those studies. Time is only going to tell. The fertility effects are also very real. When blockers are followed by cross-sex hormones, as they frequently are, fertility can be significantly impacted and sometimes irreversible. The United Kingdom actually banned puberty blockers for minors in 2024. Thank God. Following the landmark CAS review, which found insufficient evidence of long-term benefit and real evidence of actual harm. Finland, Sweden, Norway, Holland, and Denmark have all implemented significant restrictions. Critically, research on long-term brain development effects is still ongoing, which itself is a reason for caution. That's exactly what I just said a few minutes ago. We have no idea about what this is going to look like a decade from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, for those people who decided to transition and who decided to do so during puberty. So again, I'm not saying that anyone who has transitioned has made a mistake. That is not the message that I am trying to deliver here. You have the ability to do whatever you feel like doing in a free and fair society when you are an adult. That is my biggest takeaway. But what I am saying is that when you are talking about permanent, irreversible changes to a developing child's body, with documented effects on bone density, fertility, and brain development still being studied, wait until you're an adult is not a cruelty, everyone. It is the most basic standard we apply to every other major life decision. You can't get a tattoo at 15. You can't sign a contract. You cannot vote. You cannot buy alcohol. But all of a sudden, we're supposed to believe that a 12-year-old is equipped to make a decision that may affect their fertility, their cognitive function, their bone density for life. It is sinful, is the best word I can think of to describe what we are doing in this country and in many other countries around the world when it comes to gender affirming care in our young people. As I said, common sense is really the thread of this episode. And I am just so thankful. I am so thankful that so many of us still seem to have it. It just tells me that there is truly hope. And common sense is a civil liberty. The suppression of common sense is not a neutral act. It is itself a form of correction. A free society requires that its citizens be able to say true things out loud without fear. The fact that this conversation 2 years ago could have gotten people fired from their job is absolute insanity. When institutions, schools, medical boards, media outlets, sports organizations, et cetera, demand public agreement with claims that contradict observable reality and true science, trust will inevitably erode. This is not a communist society. This is not a Marxist society. You cannot brainwash people and threaten people into submission on something that is so unbelievably obvious without eroding people's trust. The women who did speak up about this, those female athletes, the parents, the feminists, were often silenced, again, fired, or greatly harassed. This is not tolerance, it's enforcement. And common sense is not the enemy of compassion. You can believe that trans people deserve dignity, safety, and legal protection. And you can believe that biological sex is a relevant category in competitive sports and pediatric medicine. All of this is true. How can you not have compassion for someone who's going through something that is probably so hard to be a kid and to feel like you're trapped in a body that isn't yours? I can only imagine what that must feel like. And even in my imagination, I could never really touch it. I could never really touch those feelings. But it breaks my heart nonetheless to know that it's happening out there. And so we can still accept and embrace children that are going through this life-altering change without submitting to the actual medications and surgeries that are irreversible, because you truly never know what will happen in their adulthood. And I'm not saying that they're going to change their mind. I think in many cases they don't change their mind, and that's fine. That's totally fine. But the difference becomes you are an adult according to societal standards. And at that point, you are free to make your own decision and just see, what comes from that. And I just feel like you'll see those detransition rates go down even more if we start to adopt that thinking. The White House response to the ruling framed it as the president's agenda being rooted not only in common sense, but in the law. And on this specific issue, a 69% supermajority of Americans agreed. Now, I do hate the fact that everything has to be so politicized, because at the end of the day, it's not even this administration who deserves this win, although they'll take all the credit for it. And yes, in many ways, they probably should. But again, I think it's just the fact that common sense is still out there. And I think that's really the prevailing message. Protecting common sense means protecting the right to ask basic questions. Is this fair? Is this safe? Are we certain? Those aren't hateful questions. They are the necessary ones. So my overall point isn't that this ruling doesn't have to be the end of a culture war. It can be the beginning of a more honest conversation. The vast majority of Americans and people around the world all want the same things: fairness, safety, dignity for everyone, and a society where truth can be spoken without punishment. Here's what I keep coming back to. The people on both sides of this debate love someone. Trans activists love trans kids and want them to be safe. Parents of female athletes love their daughters and want the field to be fair. Those are not incompatible values. They just got weaponized into a war where both sides were told the other side was pure evil. What the Supreme Court did this week wasn't declare that trans people don't exist. It's not denying that trans people are part of our society, or that they don't deserve rights, or that they aren't human beings worthy of dignity. What it said was, in the specific context of competitive sports, biological sex matters. That's it, period. This is a statement that 69% of Americans across party line, across races, across income levels already believed. So common sense didn't die. It was just held underwater for a while. And this week it finally came up for air. The lesson here isn't that one side won. The lesson is that when we stop being afraid to say true things carefully, compassionately, statistically, and clearly, the truth does have a way of holding. And that's what this show is ultimately about. That is what I believe a free society is about. And today, I'm incredibly grateful for it. So that'll do it for another episode of What a Fustercluck. Again, I'm your host, Lolita Keys. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to What a Fustercluck on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And as always, thank you so much for listening. If you want to respond to this episode, you can email me directly, whatafustercluck@gmail.com, or reach out to me on Facebook or Instagram. What a Fustercluck, Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this one.